What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we're going to be once again looking at the tuning in Modern Warfare 2, since this is such a complex thing in the game, and also they provide very little information surrounding this, so we're left to just either guess or test this for ourselves. And the main thing I wanted to focus on in today's video is just how accurate is the graph itself when you're tuning attachments in this game. Can you actually trust what's going on with that graph? Are there sweet spots like it would appear there are according to that graph? Or is this graph just as useless and often misleading as the stat bars that they put in the game? And I'll tell you right up front, I actually got some interesting results here, and in some ways you can absolutely trust this graph, and it does help you find certain sweet spots sometimes. Having said that though, for a lot of this, you obviously can't trust this, and the simple reason for this is just like those stat bars that they give us, the descriptions for these categories are far too vague, and they include a wide variety of weapon statistics in them, and they're not fragmented enough to show you exactly what's going on. The perfect example of this, and this has been the case over the years with Call of Duty with those stat bars as well, is the damage category. With those stat bars in old Call of Duty games, for instance, if you put the FMJ attachment on, which increases bullet penetration but doesn't actually increase bullet damage, if you put those on your gun, it would move that damage bar upwards, which implies that your damage is being increased, when in reality, there's way more nuance to that, and all it does is prevent you from losing as much bullet damage when shooting through a piece of cover. It's a very similar story here when we look at these tuning graphs as well. Actually, if you tune one of the barrels in the game and you tune for damage range, it changes the damage on that graph, but I've done the testing with this, and no, it doesn't actually directly impact the amount of damage that your gun is dealing. Instead, it only impacts your damage range. And since we already have a range category on this graph, why would they also make it so the damage value is changing on the graph when you're adjusting for damage range when that's not the case? I don't really know, but obviously right there you can see how you can't fully trust this graph and it's not 100% accurate. It's also a really similar story when you look at handling or mobility. Handling could include aim down sight speed, sprint out speed, reload time even potentially. We don't really know everything that goes into that, but if you see an adjustment to handling, it doesn't paint the whole picture and tell you exactly what's going on. So that's the first big thing to point out, and it's the reason that I have trust issues with this graph to begin with. For many of the areas, they're simply way too vague and include far too many characteristics for you to actually get a good indication of what's going on when those values move. Having said that though, in the situations where we're able to nail it down to a specific attribute, like we're tuning for aim walking movement speed for instance, sure that changes our mobility, which is a bit of a vague description, but we do know that we're directly impacting our aim walking movement speed according to the tuning sliders. And something really strange that I'm sure many of you guys that have spent a lot of time tuning have realized by now, sometimes as you're increasing or decreasing that slider, you'll see the points on the graph moving up and down and not lining up with that slider. Like in this case, for instance, with a Commando foregrip on the MP7, as you start to increase the aim walking movement speed on the slider, you'll see the mobility stat is increasing, but then as you continue to increase that, sometimes it'll sort of dip backwards as if it's making your aim walking movement speed worse as you're sliding toward aim walking movement speed, which sounds very counterintuitive. And I really wanted to find out if this is just a case of that graph being essentially meaningless and misleading anyway, so you can't trust it, or if that's really accurately tracking that particular stat. Because if it is accurately tracked on the graph, then that means there are sweet spots where sometimes if you tune too much in one direction, you could actually be harming the gun in that area that you're tuning toward rather than helping it by finding that sweet spot where it's at its peak. So I decided to go in and test this, and I focused just on aim walking movement speed as well as damage range, because these are the only two values that you can tune that I can test with great accuracy and have a lot of confidence in my results. When it comes to all of the other tunable stats like aim down sight speed or idle sway, I can't hand test really minute differences between them, but I can do that with aim walking movement speed and damage range. So the first one we're going to look at is actually that Commando foregrip on the MP7, because this one is an excellent example where our mobility stat on the graph actually peaks out at 0.21 inches, whereas if we go all the way up to 0.4, we're actually going to be slightly lower on that mobility stat than we were at 0.21. And I know that does seem counterintuitive, but let's have a look at the results. With that Commando foregrip with no tuning equipped, our baseline test gives us an aim walking movement speed of 3.19 meters per second. Then when we hit that apparent sweet spot at 0.21 inches on our tuning toward the direction of aim walking movement speed, we get an aim walking movement speed of 3.29 meters per second. So we're definitely seeing an increase here. It's a little bit over 3%. And then finally, with that maxed out all the way to 0.4 inches toward aim walking movement speed, we get a value of 3.28 meters per second, which is technically slightly lower than what we were seeing when we were at 0.21 inches. So these results do seem to confirm that these sweet spots exist, and it's not always in your best interest to fully max out in the direction of the stat that you want to improve. And I was actually really surprised to see this result. I honestly thought that graph was going to be way off when it comes to this, and you're better off just maxing it out if you do want the best possible aim walking movement speed, for instance. Having said that, this isn't the only stat that I tested. I also tested damage range, and with this one, I selected a gun that has a very long damage range, and I was testing in its longest damage range in order to see the differences better. So we've got the Lockman 5.56 using the barrel that gives us the biggest boost to our range, and then we're going to be tuning toward damage range. And with no tuning on this attachment, our baseline damage range is exactly 67 meters. Then it appears we see a bit of a sweet spot at 0.1 inches toward damage range, if we're just looking at the range element on the graph. And at that point, our damage range is now 68.6 meters, so we're seeing a 2.39% increase to our damage range. And then when we continue moving in the direction of damage range at 0.23 inches, this is a point where it's actually a bit of a low spot, and this is technically a little bit lower on the range graph than we saw at 0.10. So based on our previous test, we'd expect this range value to be slightly lower, but it turns out it's 68.7 meters or 0.1 meters better than the previous test, which actually goes against the aim walking movement speed test that I did. There doesn't appear to be a sweet spot with this one. And then, of course, I also tested this with it fully maxed out in the direction of damage range. And our damage range here was 69.4 meters for a total increase of almost 3.6%. Now, it is really strange that I got this result, but I think this can be explained by the fact that for some reason, when you tune toward damage range, it also impacts the damage stat on this graph. Even though I have tested this as well, the damage that you're dealing doesn't actually change. So I think what they're doing here is they're just, for some reason, splitting up the benefit to your range between damage and range. So at least when it comes to that, there's no real sweet spot there, it seems, and you may as well just max it out if you really are trying to get the most damage range possible. And with that, I hope that wasn't overly complicated for you guys. I tried to keep it fairly basic and simple here. It seems like if you are focusing on a stat that's only improving one particular area on the stat bar and not split up between multiple areas, then yes, there are sweet spots. Pay attention to that graph and look for those sweet spots as well. But when you're looking at a stat like damage range, for instance, where it's improving multiple stats at the same time on that stat graph, at that point, you don't really know what to trust. And if you are trying to squeeze out as much as possible, it seems like you just want to max it out in those cases. So there we go. Definitely some surprising results there that I didn't expect to get. And those are honestly my favorite results, is when I find something completely unexpected. And this is where I want to hear from you guys in those comments down below. What do you guys think about the fact that there are these sweet spots, at least with certain stats on the graph? Is this going to change how you tune your weapons, or not so much? Honestly, for me, I'm still generally going to avoid tuning things, mainly because there's so much mystery in the air with a lot of these different stats. And still, with a lot of my tuning testing, it seems like the cons always seem to hit you a little harder than the pros when you change one of those sliders. And at the end of the day, you're still seeing such minor changes while tuning attachments. And therefore, I just feel like obsessing over it isn't really worth the tiny, tiny changes that you're going to be seeing to your gun. But that, of course, is just my opinion. And if you guys enjoyed this video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.